So, listen to this. Jadon Sancho was supposed to be the Premier League's perfect modern winger. Quick feet, clean decisions, built for pressing football. Yet the more modern Manchester United tried to become, the less Sancho seemed to exist. And everyone tells you the same lazy story. Attitude, discipline, standards. But what if the real issue wasn't Sancho at all? What if the system never truly wanted the player he actually is?
When Jadon Sancho arrived in England, the story was already written for him. A £70 million winger returning home, a player who had to prove himself. And when things began to stall, the explanation came quickly and conveniently. Training intensity, body language, discipline. The narrative was simple, and that simplicity made it powerful. But here's the problem with that story. It evaluates the man before it ever evaluates the structure around him. At Borussia Dortmund, Sancho was not framed as a project in need of fixing. He was framed as a weapon that needed protection. His role was clear, his spaces were defined, his decisions were anticipated by the system around him. At Manchester United, none of that certainty existed, and yet the judgment focused almost exclusively on whether Sancho did enough. This is where the Football Casefile pauses the tape. Because football failures rarely begin with effort. They begin with misalignment. A player built for one kind of problem solving is dropped into a system asking different questions without ever adjusting the questions themselves. And when the answers don't come, the blame shifts downward. This case is not about defending Jadon Sancho as a flawless professional. It's about challenging the shortcut logic that reduces complex tactical incompatibility into a moral failure. Because once that framing takes hold, the system escapes scrutiny entirely. So the real thesis of this case is simple but uncomfortable. Sancho did not suddenly forget how to play football. He entered an environment that stopped asking him to play the game he was actually good at. And to understand that, we have to rewind, not to England, but to Germany, to the system that didn't try to change him, but instead made space for exactly who he was. At Borussia Dortmund, Jadon Sancho was never asked to be a symbol. He was asked to be a solution. From the outside, Dortmund looked chaotic. Young players, fast transitions, constant movement. But inside that apparent chaos was one of the clearest role definitions in Europe. Sancho didn't have to guess when to press, where to stand, or how much risk he was allowed to take. Those decisions were already made for him by the structure. His pressing responsibilities were selective, not obsessive. Dortmund did not demand that he sprint blindly toward center-backs. They wanted him alive for the next action, not exhausted by the previous one. When Sancho pressed, it was triggered. When he held his position, it was intentional. The system didn't confuse activity with usefulness. Most importantly, Dortmund protected his decision-making zones. Sancho received the ball in areas where hesitation was punished less severely, where creativity was encouraged rather than feared. He wasn't required to constantly recycle possession. He was allowed to fail because failure was built into the model. In transition, the picture became even clearer. Dortmund moved as if they expected Sancho to make the final choice. Runners trusted him. Midfielders delayed for him. The system bent around his strengths instead of asking him to bend around its ideology. This is the detail that often gets missed. Dortmund didn't make Sancho disciplined by shouting louder. They made him disciplined by clarity. When a player knows exactly why he's standing in a certain space, effort becomes natural. Movement becomes instinctive. Confidence stops being fragile. And that's why Sancho didn't look like a luxury at Dortmund. He looked like a necessity. Because the system didn't ask him to prove he belonged. It assumed he did, and then built around that assumption. Which brings us to the moment everything changed. Not because Sancho changed leagues, but because he entered a system that wasn't sure what problem he was meant to solve in the first place.
At Manchester United, Jadon Sancho didn't enter a system. He entered a question mark. From the first weeks, the contrast with Dortmund was subtle but decisive. There was talk of pressing, intensity, standards, but very little clarity about roles. United pressed in moments, not in sequences. Triggers were implied rather than defined, and for a winger like Sancho, that ambiguity is poison. At Dortmund, Sancho knew where his risk was allowed. At United, risk became situational and often punished. One lost duel could lead to isolation. One failed take-on could mean the ball simply stopped coming back to his side. The margin for creative error shrank, but the demand for output remained. Tactically, Sancho was moved without explanation. Left wing, right wing, deeper zones, touchline-hugging roles that stripped him of central access. The problem wasn't versatility. The problem was that none of these roles came with protection. No automatisms, no consistent spacing, no guarantee that the next action would arrive in a familiar picture. Pressing, too, became a misunderstanding. United wanted visible effort. Dortmund wanted effective effort. Sancho wasn't failing to run, he was failing to run into meaning. And when pressing lacks collective timing, the most intelligent players are often the first to hesitate. Not out of laziness, but out of doubt. Here's the uncomfortable truth. At United, Sancho was rarely the first option in build-up. He was an accessory, not a reference point. And players who thrive on rhythm cannot manufacture rhythm alone. When the system doesn't lean toward you, confidence erodes quietly. This is where the narrative flipped. Instead of asking why the system couldn't locate Sancho, the conversation turned toward why Sancho couldn't locate himself. Responsibility moved downward, structure escaped scrutiny. And once that shift happens, the ending becomes predictable. Because when a player no longer knows what problem he's supposed to solve, every performance starts to look like a lack of commitment, and every lack of commitment becomes a character flaw. But the real twist of this case is still coming, because the issue was never that Sancho couldn't press. It's that pressing was never designed with him in mind. Here's the moment where this case turns uncomfortable. Because if you strip away the headlines, the clips, the accusations, one truth remains. Jadon Sancho did press. He ran, he tracked back, he followed instructions. What he didn't do was press inside a structure that gave those actions meaning. Pressing is not effort. Pressing is coordination. At Manchester United, pressing often existed as an idea rather than a mechanism. Players jumped without cover. Lines moved without synchronization. For a winger, this creates a dilemma: run and break the shape, or hesitate and look disinterested. Either choice leads to criticism. Neither choice leads to control. This is why intelligent players suffer first in broken systems. They sense the lack of connection before others do. They hesitate not because they're unwilling, but because they're unconvinced. Sancho's hesitation was read as defiance, but it was closer to confusion. And this is where the system quietly shifts blame. When structure fails, responsibility becomes individualized. Pressing stops being about collective timing and becomes a test of character. Who runs hardest? Who looks the most aggressive? Who can be seen doing something, anything? In that environment,
Players like Sancho lose their value quickly, not because they're ineffective, but because their effectiveness is invisible without cohesion. Their strengths don't shout, they whisper, and whispers die in chaos. The cruel irony is this: the more United demanded visible intensity, the less space there was for Sancho's intelligence to function. The system evolved away from him, but kept asking him to adapt without changing itself. At that point, failure isn't accidental, it's structural. Because when a system changes direction, but the player's role is never redefined, adaptation becomes a myth. You're not evolving, you're surviving, until you can't anymore. And once the story turns moral, discipline, attitude, professionalism, the tactical conversation ends permanently. But to understand why that narrative sticks so easily in England, we need to step back, away from Sancho, away from Manchester United, and into the culture that shapes how football stories are told in the first place.
To understand why Jadon Sancho's story hardened so quickly into a moral judgment, you have to understand how English football culture tells stories. In England, effort is sacred, visibility is confused with value, running is treated as honesty, and when systems fail, the language instinctively shifts away from structure and toward character. It's easier to question a player's attitude than to interrogate a collective idea that never fully existed. This is where Sancho became more than a footballer. He became a symbol of modern players, of overseas development, of something that didn't quite fit the traditional image of Premier League intensity. And symbols are rarely given nuance. The media narrative didn't form because journalists are malicious. It formed because the framework was already there. A talented player struggling inside an undefined system needs an explanation, and culture supplies the quickest one available. Discipline, mentality, professionalism. Once those words enter the conversation, tactical context disappears. Every training omission becomes confirmation. Every absence becomes proof. The system itself is no longer on trial. The player is. This is not unique to Sancho. It's a recurring pattern in English football. When identity is unclear, control is reasserted through morality. Players are asked to adapt not just tactically, but culturally, to perform effort in ways that are easily recognized and publicly rewarded. Sancho didn't fail to meet the physical demands of football. He failed to align with a story that needed him to look a certain way while doing it. And when that alignment breaks, recovery becomes almost impossible, because you're no longer being judged on what you contribute, but on what you represent. At that point, football decisions stop being reversible. They become reputational. Which brings us to the final question of this case, not one about talent, not even one about tactics, but about responsibility. So here we are, at the end of the file. And the question is no longer really about Jadon Sancho. Because if this story were only about talent, the conclusion would be easy. Talent doesn't disappear at 23. It doesn't evaporate between leagues. It doesn't forget how to solve problems overnight. The harder question is this: when a system changes its identity, who carries the burden of adaptation? Is it always the player expected to reshape instincts built over years, to perform effort in visible ways, to survive inside roles that were never clearly designed? Or does responsibility also sit with the structure that recruited him, celebrated his strengths, and then quietly moved away from them? Sancho didn't refuse to adapt. He adapted into uncertainty. And uncertainty is where confidence erodes without noise. No explosion, no scandal, just distance, fewer touches, less trust, a slow retreat from relevance. This case was never about excuses, it was about alignment. Because football systems don't fail loudly, they fail silently, by asking the wrong questions of the wrong players and then blaming those players when the answers don't come back fast enough. Maybe Sancho will restart elsewhere. Maybe he won't. That's not the point of this file. The point is this: if a system cannot clearly explain why it needs a player, it will eventually convince everyone that the player was never needed at all. And when that happens, the verdict is decided long before the evidence is finished. So the case remains open. Was Jadon Sancho a superstar the system didn't want? Or was he a warning of what happens when football forgets to adapt itself? That choice is yours.